I'm Tom Biebighauser. I work as a wildlife biologist and a wetland ecologist under contract with the BC Wildlife Federation. I started taking trips to BC in 2003, and I've helped with the BC Wildlife Federation Wetlands Institute for many years. I began building wetlands in 1979 with the U.S. Forest Service, spent a career of 34 years working as a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Forest Service, where I built wetlands and streams. I retired 7 years ago, and I've continued to build wetlands and streams. And I really enjoy coming to BC and working with people who are interested in restoring these fascinating ecosystems. But now, I'd like you to take a journey with me. We're going to go around BC and we're going to look at some wetlands, and we're going to learn about the people who are working to manage these wetlands. And you're going to see that wetlands are probably the most amazing ecosystem on Earth. So in this presentation, we're going to learn why communities are working to protect and to restore wetland ecosystems. Wetlands generally contain water all or part of the year. You're looking at a wetland that we call a shallow marsh. There are many types of wetlands. And a shallow marsh, it's best identified by that presence of some open water. And oftentimes you'll see the cattails around the edge. And if you look at it, you see these lily pads, the pond lilies growing out in it. Here's another photo showing a shallow marsh. And this shallow marsh is found on the Salix and Sedge farm near Salmo, BC. Now, shallow marshes contain an amazing diversity of plants and animals. We're going to be learning more about shallow marshes in this presentation. Now, this is a different type of wetland called a fen wetland. And fens have sedges in them, an abundance of sedges. And fens are important to elk and to deer and to sandhill cranes. To elk, they're important for feeding. They feed on the sedges, which are high in sodium. Sandhill cranes will find all sorts of frogs and toads to eat in wetland areas, and they use them for nesting. Now, the soils in fens are saturated like other wetlands, and if you were to go out into a fen and dig a hole, that hole would soon fill with water. Now, this photo shows what we call a wet meadow wetland. And look at that diversity of bulrushes and sedges in it. And the wet meadows support high populations of small mammals. And if you walk through a wet meadow, you'll see these small mammals and voles scurrying all over the place. Now, these voles and the mice provide food for hawks, owls, fox, and bobcats. Now, this is an area most people would think is not a wetland. We call it a shrub fen wetland. You're likely to find sedges in a shrub fen wetland, willow and alder. And these shrubs in a shrub fen wetland are of critical importance to moose for food. This is where you find moose, especially in the winter. Now, this is a swamp or a swamp wetland. And it makes sense that trees and shrubs are what you'll see growing in a swamp wetland. Now, walking through a swamp wetland is a little bit of a challenge because of all the logs that are on the ground, and the soils are wet and spongy. And a person is likely to see many mosses and ferns that are growing in swamps. Now, this is also part of a swamp, and you see that there's a patch of skunk cabbage growing in it. Swamps will often contain small pools of water like what you see here. And it's interesting, all the different amphibians that breed in those pools, like salamanders and frogs. Now, this swamp is located on Jim and Janet Mainland's farm near Meadow Creek, BC. Now, this is what's called an ephemeral wetland or a seasonal wetland or a vernal pond. They have many names. Now, ephemeral wetlands fill with water in the spring, often from snowmelt, but by fall, they have dried. And you'll see shallow water in these ephemeral wetlands after a thunderstorm, but you'll especially see it in the spring. But then by the end of the season, oftentimes they're bare and you see all this exposed mud in ephemeral wetland. Now, look at the diversity of wetlands in this photo. Now, this was taken at the Creston Valley Wildlife Management Area. And if you look closely, you'll see swamps, you'll see marsh, and you'll see wet meadow. Pretty amazing. Wetlands are fascinating places to explore. The swamp that you see here is not a scary place like what the movies would make it out to be, but instead they're just full of all these plants and animals, and few people have been in swamps. I encourage you to go and visit a swamp when you have a chance. And when you visit a wetland, you can't help but see an abundance of wildlife. People will travel great distances to see wildlife in wetland areas. Now, do you know what type of wetland you're looking at here? If you said shallow marsh, you're right. One can always find frogs to photograph in a wetland. And wetlands support so many amphibians and reptiles and mammals and birds. It's just incredible what you'll find. And I love taking groups out to wetland areas because they start seeing these animals that they've never seen before. When you visit a wetland, you're likely to see mallard ducks. And who doesn't enjoy seeing mallard ducklings in a wetland? These wetlands produce the young of more species than you can believe. Wood ducks depend on wetland areas. The female, she's cryptically colored. She's the one who lays her eggs in the hollow trees near wetland areas. The male is quite gaudy, and the Latin name for the wood duck means bride. It's quite appropriate, quite a beautiful animal. Can you guess the name of this bird? I'm sure you can. This is the male red-winged blackbird. The bright red wing patch lets you know that it's a male redwing. They will build their nests in the cattails of a shallow marsh wetland. And it's interesting, the size of that patch is really important to the male. A friend of mine did a research project on red-winged blackbirds, and what he would do is adjust the size of that patch by using black tape. And he found the larger the red patch, the more likely the male was to attract a mate. Here we're looking at a yellow-headed blackbird on the edge of a shallow marsh wetland. The yellow-headed blackbird will also nest in cattails. And this is a GH, otherwise known as a great blue heron. And these feed on frogs, snakes, crayfish, and fish in wetland areas. Unfortunately, their numbers are decreasing in BC. Now, if you ever find one of these, enjoy it. If you ever seen one, enjoy it at a distance. A friend of mine once found an injured great blue heron. He picked it up, and it speared him right between the eyes, and we learned that wasn't a good thing to do. White-tailed deer feed on the aquatic plants found in wetlands. Now, we really didn't know why they did this. We thought, well, I'm sure because they taste good, but we did some analysis and we dried these aquatic plants in wetlands and we tested them for sodium. And then we also dried the terrestrial plants that the deer were eating, tested them for sodium. And we found out that the aquatic plants would have 10 to 20,000 parts per million of sodium, whereas the terrestrial plants would have 1/10 of that. So what we find is the aquatic plants and wetlands will concentrate sodium and other heavy metals. And really, this is a great way to clean runoff from areas where we're putting salt on highways, is to run that water through a wetland. Moose will depend on the aquatic plants and wetlands for their minerals. And the water in the wetlands cools this large animal that gets overheated in the summer and also gives it a break from the insects that will torment it during the summer months. Now, elk feed on the plants in and near wetland areas. Of course, they drink the water, but what I mentioned earlier is the sedges around wetlands are of critical importance to elk, especially in the fall. Now, the western painted turtle is a species at risk in BC. They depend on wetlands for their survival, and you're likely to see these in shallow marsh wetlands. And who really isn't astounded by the beauty of tundra swans using wetland areas? And these tundra swans are using a wetland that the BC Wildlife Federation helped to restore on Terry Halloran's farm near Meadow Creek, BC. The grizzly bear and cubs frequent wetland areas. I see an unbelievable use of wetlands by grizzly bears, feeding on the sedges and the rushes and the cattails and the horsetail that are growing in the saturated soils. And really, it makes sense that the bears would use wetlands because there's all this shallow water and sunshine, and there's just a tremendous amount to eat, just like walking into a garden. The western toad you're looking at here is another species at risk that depends on wetland areas. Now, the western toad faces many problems across the province. Number one being wetland drainage, but number two is being run over on a rainy night during the breeding season. You'll see an abundance of toads crossing highways at specific locations, and it's a real concern. Basically, slow down on a rainy night if you're out driving about, please. Here are the tadpoles of the western toad. We call them the larvae. Now, they have a good chance of surviving if they grow up in the ephemeral wetland that does not contain non-native fish or the non-native American bullfrog. The American bullfrog will consume these, and ephemeral wetlands don't hold water long enough for the bullfrog to reproduce effectively. The northern leopard frog, one of the rarest frog species in BC. And the only place it's found now naturally in BC is on the Creston Valley Wildlife Management Area. You'll see a diversity of plants growing in the saturated soils of wetland areas. And many of these, of course, are wildflowers. And these aquatic plants growing in wetlands attract a diversity of pollinators, especially the monarch. Now, the monarch is in decline across North America, and there's great concern in the US over the survival of the monarch. And here, the monarch's using swamp milkweed, which grows in the saturated soils of wetland areas. This beautiful plant is called steeplebush. Other people call it hardhack. Others call it spirea. But again, it's important for pollinators, and it grows in and near wetland areas. I'm sure you recognize this as skunk cabbage. The flower is just beautiful on the skunk cabbage. The odor is something that it's a acquired taste, whether or not you enjoy the odor of a skunk cabbage. And here we're looking at yellow water lily, and they grow in the shallow water of shallow marsh wetlands, and just a beautiful plant that flowers for quite an extended period. We find some rare plants growing in the saturated soils of wetlands. This is Oregon checkered mallow, and it's growing in a wet metal wetland near Rossland, BC. Now, wetlands naturally clean contaminated water. If you take contaminated water, whether it's contaminated with phosphorus or nitrogen or heavy metals, and you put it into a wetland, when that water comes out, it's going to be much cleaner. So many communities are cleaning pollutants by building wetlands and filtering these pollutants from the water by going through the wetland areas. Now, the BC Wildlife Federation has been working with BCIT and many other partners for a number of years to build wetlands near Logan Lake. And Logan Lake has some problems with runoff from an old salt storage shed and a golf course. And we're building these wetlands to intercept and to clean that runoff with great success. Now, the BC Wildlife Federation designed and helped build wetlands that remove sediment from a development before it enters Quamachin Lake near Duncan, BC. And here's one of the wetlands that we built for that purpose. Now, wetlands have many values, one of which is that they help to reduce flooding. And a wetland will absorb floodwater just like a giant sponge. This is of great importance because flooding has become a major problem in many communities. And the trouble is, it's getting worse. The people in Grand Forks, BC know all about the disaster we call flooding. More than 4 million houses and small apartment buildings across the United States have a substantial risk of extensive flood damage. And this is according to an organization called the First Street Foundation. They're a nonprofit. The cost of flood damage to homes in the US is expected to increase by over 50% in the next 30 years. Now, that's really a sobering thought. If you ever cleaned up after a flood, it is a mess and it's really hard work and it costs you a lot of money. Floods will cause significant damage to our highways as well as our structures, and it just takes a lot of time to repair these, and it costs a lot of money to repair flood damage. Okay, this is the logo for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who have worked to control flooding across the U.S. and the world for many generations. And they have found that the lowest cost way of controlling flooding is to protect existing wetlands. So if you have existing wetlands in your community and you protect them, you are attenuating flooding. They found the next lowest way of attenuating flooding is to restore wetlands that have been drained and filled. And what's the most expensive way? Well, that's to put in dams and dikes and levees and pumps. That's really an expensive way to control flooding. The BC Wildlife Federation is working in partnership with the Yakinoki Lower Kootenai Band, the Columbia Basin Trust, and the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program, and AFSAR, which is Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk, to complete the Yakinoki Hunting Grounds Ecosystem Restoration Project near Creston, BC. The Yakinoki Hunting Grounds project involves removing over 2 kilometers of constructed dams and reconnecting over 90 hectares of the floodplain with the Kootenai River. And I'm hoping you get to see this project. It is just amazing, the results. Here's where one of 2 major riffles was constructed when we reconnected 1.2 kilometers of the Goat River south that had been cut off years ago by the construction of dams. And this is on the Yakinoki Hunting Grounds project. As part of the Yakinoki Hunting Grounds project, we restored 4 streams. And you're looking at one of these restored streams that had not held water for many years. As part of the Hunting Grounds project, we built over 60 wetlands and removed 46 large mounds that have been placed in wetlands. And you're looking at one of the wetlands that was restored as part of the project, and this wetland is less than a year old. Now, the BC Wildlife Federation is working in partnership with the City of Trail to remove the Cambridge Creek Reservoir Dam, the Violin Lake Dam, and 2 other smaller dams. These dams were originally built in 1918 to supply water to the City of Trail. They're no longer needed. The dams are failing and need to be removed. So the BC Wildlife Federation is working with the City of Trail to design and this summer to remove these dams. And this will be done in a way that really restores wetland areas, streams, and quite a habitat for diversity of species. Okay, so what about mosquitoes? If somebody finds out that you are interested in wetlands or working to protect wetlands, they're going to bring up mosquitoes right away. They're going to say, if you do this, you're going to be causing mosquitoes to become more abundant. And everybody knows mosquitoes carry disease. So what's the answer? Let's find out. Oh, first of all, this is what mosquito larvae look like. Please stare at this photo. You'll find these in shallow puddles of water that only last for maybe a month to a month and a half. And look at the size of the larva. You know, they're maybe about a centimeter long, and they wiggle. They come to the surface to breathe oxygen, and you'll see them in these clumps. They're really easy to identify. You don't even need a net. So you can go to a puddle of water and see if it has mosquitoes larvae in just moments. Now, the red circles show where mosquito larvae may be found around your home. And every red circle shows where water can puddle, but only for a short time period, but yet long enough for mosquitoes to breed, but not long enough for mosquito predators to start occupying the water to control the mosquitoes. This is not a healthy wetland. Water in this ditch, well, the ditch was dug to drain a wetland. So there is water in the ditch because it's carrying water from the wetland. But the ditch now provides mosquitoes with an excellent place to breed, but not the native amphibians and invertebrates. See the ruts in this metal wetland? Mosquitoes are likely to breed in these ruts because they only hold water for a short time period, a month to a month and a half. Is this a healthy wetland? No. This is a puddle that's in a tire. You may have some of these in your backyard. You may want to recycle those tires if you do, because more than likely you're going to find mosquito larvae using that puddle of water. This bucket contained mosquito larvae. Buckets left outside will collect water for short time periods, and the mosquitoes find this water, and the water doesn't contain mosquito predators, and they do quite well breeding in these buckets. Animal watering troughs are excellent, provide excellent habitat to mosquitoes in which to lay their eggs and for their larvae to develop. They are not a healthy wetland. So what controls mosquitoes near healthy wetlands? Well, dragonflies. Dragonfly adults will feed on adult mosquitoes. The same way, dragonfly larvae will feed on mosquito larvae. So let's go over that again. If you have the larva of dragonfly in a wetland, which is healthy, then those dragonfly larvae are going to control the larva of the mosquito that has laid its eggs in that wetland area. This is a damselfly. They will also feed on adult mosquitoes. And yes, the larva of the damselfly will feed on the larva of mosquitoes in healthy wetlands. Maybe you've picked up one of these, a predaceous diving beetle. These will feed on mosquitoes, mosquito larvae in wetland areas. And this is a rough-skinned newt. Rough-skinned newts are common in BC, and their larvae also feed on mosquito larvae. And here's a northwestern salamander. So perhaps the most effective predator of mosquito larvae in wetlands is the salamander. And salamander larvae will control mosquito larvae. And the northwestern salamander can be found breeding in wetlands across BC. Now, how do we tell the salamander larva from the frog larva? See the exposed gills? That's a really good clue that this is a salamander larva and not a frog larva. Here's a close-up showing the long-toed salamander larva. Again, there are publications out there proving that salamander larvae are the most efficient predator of mosquito larvae known. So if you can protect or restore a wetland that has salamanders using it, you're not going to have this breeding of mosquitoes taking place. At night, we have the bats that are controlling the mosquitoes in and around wetland areas. And during the day, we have the tree swallows that are controlling the adult mosquitoes in and around wetland areas. So what do we say about a healthy wetland? Mosquitoes may check in, but they won't check out. So mosquitoes don't have a chance of surviving if they fly near or lay their eggs in a healthy wetland, because all the other animals that are in that wetland that will use them for food. Okay, I'd like to talk just a minute here about ephemeral wetlands that we also call vernal pools. Now, these wetlands will fill in the spring, and they're going to most likely dry in the late summer or fall. Ephemeral wetlands are uncommon in British Columbia. And I think many of them, well, I know many of them have been drained and filled, and many people believe they have little value because they don't hold water all year. But an ephemeral wetland is not likely to contain fish, especially non-native fish like the sunfish. And this is because they don't hold water all year. An ephemeral wetland is not likely to provide breeding habitat for the non-native American bullfrog. Why? Because bullfrog tadpoles require 2 years to develop in water. So if your wetland goes dry once in a while, the frogs are not able to reproduce, the American bullfrog, and you won't be building up high populations of them in an area. Now, the Pacific tree frog breeds in ephemeral wetlands, and these ephemeral wetlands are critical importance to many species of native frogs for breeding because they don't support fish and they don't support the non-native American bullfrog. You're likely to see Columbia spotted frogs breeding in ephemeral wetlands. And you will see western toads breeding in ephemeral wetlands. Now, the western toad tadpole, like other toad tadpoles, can sense when a vernal pond is drying quickly, and they can actually accelerate their development and emerge as smaller toadlets if needed, so they're not left high and dry. The northern leopard frog depends on ephemeral wetlands for breeding. The species doesn't do well in waters that contain non-native bass, sunfish, or the American bullfrog. The only place you're going to find crustaceans like the fairy shrimp are in wetlands that don't contain fish, and these are the ephemeral wetlands. You may find clam shrimp, another crustacean, using ephemeral wetlands. Now, these provide food for salamanders, and they also provide food for waterfowl. So if you really want to help waterfowl, protect or restore an ephemeral wetland. Why? Because they contain this incredible abundance of invertebrates and annual plant seeds that waterfowl use for food. So the key to helping migrating waterfowl is to have these ephemeral wetlands with water in them during migration. And you're going to see waterfowl use that is remarkable. I have sampled hundreds of wetlands for invertebrates. And what happens is that I'll start on the road and start walking towards the wetland. And if the wetland contains an abundance of ducks, I know right away that it's going to have a lot of invertebrates in it for them to eat. And more than likely, it's going to be an ephemeral wetland. Now, wetlands are being used to clean stormwater, in many communities across North America. The BC Wildlife Federation has worked with the Nature Conservancy of Canada to build a series of these stormwater wetlands near Duncan on Vancouver Island. And these are removing sediment before it can enter Quamachin Lake. The BC Wildlife Federation is working with the British Columbia Institute of Technology and the community of Logan Lake. And we're building wetlands that clean runoff from this old salt storage shed and a golf course before it can enter Logan Lake. Now, the BCIT instructs a week-long course each year where students may learn about wetlands and become involved in the restoration of wetlands. Now, the BC Wildlife Federation has helped the Salt Spring Island Conservancy to design and build wetlands on Salt Spring Island. And we've built these wetlands to help clean runoff before it enters Blackbird Lake. The restored wetlands are also important breeding habitat for the northern red-legged frog, a species at risk. Welcome to Selmo. The next time you're in Selmo, please look up KP Park. And at the entrance of KP Park, you're going to see a wetland. The BC Wildlife Federation worked with the city of Selmo to build this wetland to clean stormwater runoff from the town of Selmo. And the wetland is not easy to spot, but there is a sign that you can look for as you enter KP Park. Now, to build that wetland, we used an excavator and a dump truck to remove large quantities of soil that had been used years ago to fill in the wetland. We used the excavator to shape a natural basin for the wetland and place branches and logs in it to provide habitat for wildlife. Now, the wetland at KP Park, we built it in 2012 as part of the BC Wildlife Federation Wetlands Institute. And the participants of the Wetlands Institute helped to design, construct, and plant this wetland area. And here we are planting native dogwoods around the edge of the wetland. So the BC Wildlife Federation Wetlands Institute, it offers hands-on training in wetland restoration and design, a most unique course. And if you attend, you're going to learn how to control erosion, clean runoff, establish native plants around restored wetland areas. We even started a Design Star competition as part of the wetland, and we asked participants to build toad houses around the wetlands that they helped to restore. And you're looking at the first place winner right here. Fantastic toad house. So here's the new wetland at KP Park the day it was finished. It just has a little bit of water in the bottom because it's designed to fill with stormwater runoff, not stay full all the time. And here we are a few years later. Looks pretty good. So wetlands can be built in communities to clean runoff, and they're beautiful additions to the community. And what we're finding is that if you have a beautiful wetland to look at, your home is going to be worth more. Wetlands can increase property values in a community, and they certainly add to the quality of life. Here's an interpretive sign that the city of Selma placed near the wetland, and it explains the wetland and its functions and how it's cleaning runoff from the city. The BC Wildlife Federation is working with many educators to build wetlands at schools for science education. This wetland was built in 2009 at Cahuche Elementary School in Lillooet. You know, if you explore a wetland with students, you're going to have their full attention. For a real adventure, ask them to put on a pair of rubber boots or waders, hand them a net, and you're going to open up a world of investigation, and they can have fun catching tadpoles and dragonfly larvae. I took this photo of two high school students who were completing a worksheet at a wetland a number of years ago. And the man on the left stopped me in a store, and it had been 20 years since I had seen him last. He asked if I remembered him, and I said, no, I mean, this guy's 20 years older. But he proceeded to tell me how he knew me. And he said, we went on this wetland field trip, and he told me everything we did on that field trip. So, you know, if you can remember what you did on a field trip 20 years ago, it shows how wetlands can serve as outdoor classrooms for experiential learning. And students are going to remember these wetlands the rest of their lives and how important they are to fish and wildlife. So when the BC Wildlife Federation builds a wetland at school, and they're going to be building one this summer at Mackenzie Secondary School, students are involved in every step of the process. They learn about the importance of wetlands, they learn about native species, they learn about control of non-native species, and they learn how to establish native species around the restored wetland. And they have fun. Here we are spreading woody leaves around the wetland. Now, why would we throw leaves in a wetland area? Well, these leaves are going to decompose and provide invertebrates with food. And then in turn, the invertebrates are going to be eaten by salamanders, and we have the whole food chain going there. Here's a wetland that was built at Ecole Mount Provost School. And this wetland is built in Duncan, BC. And it's less than like a month old in this photo. And here's a wetland that the BC Wildlife Federation helped build at Skleps School of Excellence in Kamloops, BC. And the students planted the wetland with culturally important plants. Now, the BC Wildlife Federation worked with a number of partners to help build a series of wetlands at North Jubilee Park. And this is located in Rossland next to the Rossland Secondary School. Now, the wetlands at North Jubilee Park are being used by students and people who take walks in the community. People can walk around the wetlands. They can stay on the road. There's beautiful trails for them to hike. And they've had so many volunteers working on these projects over the years that you're going to see an impressive diversity of plants in and around these restored wetlands. The wetlands that were built at North Jubilee, they're cleaning a runoff from the city, and they're also saving a lot of mowing. You know, we'd mow a lot of areas in BC just because it's traditional. We think it looks nice. And many of these mowed areas are really drained wetlands. Well, provides great opportunities for wetland restoration and can save your community money in maintenance. And the BC Wildlife Federation has a program that helps farmers and wildlife by restoring wetlands and fields. And these fields are too wet for people to farm. The program works by building a wetland on about half of the area that is too wet to farm, and spreading the soil that's removed from restoring the wetland over the other half that's too wet to farm, and raising its elevation so it can be farmed. Here's an excavator and a dozer that are building a wetland, and then they're taking that soil and they're spreading it on higher ground, and they're raising its elevation so it can be farmed. Much of this work can be done in the winter when the soils are frozen and you're less likely to get stuck with heavy equipment. Now, in looking at this photo, you can see the soil in the foreground. That's the area where the elevations were raised and the soil was removed and spread there for improving the field. But if you look in the background, you will see all that snow, and you can see an artificial beaver lodge that we built. And that area with snow is the wetland that was restored as part of the project. Come back a year later, here's how the area where the soil was spread appears. It's much better drained and it can be used for farming. The new wetland was built in the foreground, and if you look in the background, you can see where the soils were raised for farming. So the BC Wildlife Federation helped Brenda and John to restore wetlands to improve their land for farming and to help the environment near Kelowna. Here's a 1 hectare sized wetland that the BC Wildlife Federation worked with Manon Van Tool to build at Meadow Creek. And the soil that was removed from building this wetland was used to improve a field over 1 hectare in size. I'd like to introduce you to Brandon Parsons and Callie Olek, and they are the owners of Salix and Sedge Farm near Selmo, BC. Now, Brandon and Callie own land that was way too wet to farm and way too expensive to drain. They farmed for a living, and they liked wetlands, and they liked helping wildlife. So the BC Wildlife Federation helped them to design a wetland restoration project on their farm that would restore wetlands and improve land for farming. And here's one of the newly restored wetlands on their farm. It's now providing fantastic habitat to wildlife. It has all these pits and mounds and large woody debris where animals can hide, and it's really quite unique and beautiful to look at. What did we do with the soil that was removed? Here's one of the fields that was raised in elevation for farming. And this field was raised almost 1 meter in elevation. Now, everyone is pleased with the results, and I think it's a real win-win. The farmer gets valuable land for farming and valuable wetlands for watching wildlife. It's interesting what Callie and Brandon had done with one of the improved fields. They built a greenhouse on it. Amazing. You know, good use of the land right there, and that helps their farming operation. The BC Wildlife Federation is helping ranchers to build wetlands that help their livestock and help wildlife. And you're looking at a new wetland here that was built with a livestock watering ramp near Barnhart Vale, BC. Now, this wetland was built to provide habitat for the Great Basin spadefoot, a species at risk near Barnhart Vale. And the wetland perimeter was fenced and the ramp was built so that cows would have access to clean water. And the fence was put in so that wildlife would have a refuge where they won't get crushed by the livestock. I wish I could show you this place at Stud Pasture. The wetland at Stud Pasture once held water all year, but for many, many years it had been dry. And participants in the 2010 Wetlands Institute helped to restore the wetland so it would contain water all year. And afterwards, the wetland was fenced and a ramp was added to provide livestock with access to water. What a remarkable difference. What we found is that the soils on the site were high in clay and they were compacted because of the drought. The livestock were looking for that last bit of water. So what we were able to do was to loosen these soils, reconnecting the wetland with the groundwater, and then fence it so they would not be compacted again. And this wetland should hold water really for hundreds of years now. This wetland had also been dry for many, many years. We rebuilt it in 2016 and it now contains water all year. Here's another dry basin that used to contain water, and we restored the area and it's now fenced, and the ramp allows access to clean water for the livestock and protects the wildlife from being crushed. So most people who are interested in wetlands because of the wildlife, which is a good thing. So many of the wetlands that the BC Wildlife Federation helps to restore, the projects are designed for specific species of wildlife. And in turn, communities are finding that tourists are traveling great distances to see and hear wildlife in BC that are using these wetland areas. It helps to know a little bit about waterfowl when building a wetland. Watch how ducks feed. Many species of waterfowl use shallow water and they will tip up to feed. Now, here's one of many wetlands built with BC Wildlife Federation help at Meadow Creek. And I'd like you to stare at this and see if you can count the number of ducks that are using this wetland. Now, remember, there may be a number of ducks that are loafing on the logs we placed in the restored wetlands. Now, this wetland is really quite shallow. It's less than 50 centimeters deep. And that's an Audrey and Eric Matthews farm. Time's up. 86 ducks is what I count. 86 ducks using this new wetland. Pretty amazing. Tanbo means dragonfly in Japanese. And these wetlands, the Tanbo wetlands, were built on the Tullaberry farm with BC Wildlife Federation help. The Tullaberry farm is near Selmo, BC. Now, what they show us is wetlands don't have to be large to be of value to wildlife. The small wetlands that were restored in the Tullaberry farm are being used by many species of ducks, frogs, and then the western toad. This shallow wetland in the Tullaberry farm was colonized naturally by native sedges within a couple of years after it was built. The logs that were placed in the wetlands are providing waterfowl with places to loaf. And the logs are also being used in these wetlands by western painted turtles for basking. Great blue herons are using the logs for perching while hunting. Now, see the standing dead trees called snags? They were purposely placed in this restored wetland. And we found that they have great importance to many wildlife species in using wetlands. The way to look at a snag in a wetland, it's like furniture in a room. If you place a snag in or near a wetland, more than likely the bald eagle is going to perch on it. And this is a good way to make wildlife visible to visitors. Place snags in wetlands or near wetlands and look at all the bird species that are likely to use that snag and the wetland area. The great bull heron and the bald eagle are likely to build their nest at or near the tops of snags near wetlands. Get out there at night and you're going to find that many bat species are using these snags. They're going to use them during the day for roosting habitat. We place boulders in wetlands that we restore. These are heat sinks for snakes, and also the important basking sites for the western painted turtle. Okay, it's time for a quiz. Are you ready? Okay, I'm going to show you a series of images, and I'd like you to decide if it's a natural wetland or a human constructed wetland. Are you ready? Okay, let's find out if you can tell the difference between natural wetlands or constructed wetlands. Okay, this one right here. What do you think? You're right. It was built in 2012 for $1,900. It's a constructed wetland. Okay, let's try the next one. All right, looking at this wetland here, look at that diversity of plants. All the sedges, all the rushes. Is it restored or is it natural? It was restored by the Salt Spring Island Conservancy in 2016. And we built it on a golf course that went out of business. Prior to construction, the area was dominated by reed canary grass. Now it supports this amazing diversity of plants. Are you ready for the next one? Okay, here we go. Take a look at this wetland right here. Restored by humans, or is it natural? Well, this wetland was restored by BCIT students near Logan Lake in 2015. And they built it in one day using an excavator. Not bad. Okay, let's try another one right here. Oh, this is a large wetland right here. It's got a lot of cattails around it. What do you think, constructed or natural? Oh, it's a constructed emergent wetland, or we call it a shallow marsh. And this was built by Ducks Unlimited Canada near 100 Mile House. And they were so proud of that wetland and saw so much value that they built their visitor center right on the edge of that wetland. That's really good. You see the same thing in Cranbrook, where a constructed wetland, a visitor center for the community, is right on the shores of it. Okay, how about this wetland right here? That's an incredible diversity of plants in that wetland. I see cattails, water plankton. I see some sedges and rushes. Constructed or natural? Let's find out. Oh, this was built in one day using an aquatic safe liner that was covered with soil for $1,900. That's not too bad. Okay, let's look at another one right here. Constructed or natural? All right. The BC Wildlife Federation helped build this wetland on the Tullaberry Farm in 2013 for only $1,500. Pretty good deal right there. Okay, so you've seen some pretty attractive wetlands. Now let's look at an ugly wetland right here. Isn't that ugly? Oh my gosh. Who ever built that? And what did it cost? Oh, must have cost a lot of money. Constructed or natural? Well, you're right with either answer. It's a natural wetland because an elk made it by wallowing, but yet it's a constructed wetland because the elk made it by wallowing. And it contains fairy shrimp, and it contains a diversity of breeding frogs. So wetlands don't have to look good to be of value to wildlife. Okay, let's take a look at another wetland, constructed or natural. Again, look at the diversity of plants in this wetland. Well, it was restored by the Salt Spring Island Conservancy in 2016, and this used to be a golf course. Remarkable, isn't it? Okay, we're going to make things a little bit tougher now, right here. Natural or constructed? This wetland is natural, and it's located near Stillwater, Minnesota, and it has lots of cattails. Natural wetlands do have cattails. Okay, this one here. Just a few more. Natural or constructed? Again, you're right with either answer. It's a natural wetland, but it's still a beaver pond. And if you look for that straight line, that's a giveaway. That's the beaver dam right there. Okay, we just have a couple more. This is a wetland we haven't talked about. This is called a bog. And bogs can take thousands of years to develop under unbelievably restrictive hydrologic conditions. So this has to be a natural wetland. Uh-oh. It is a natural wetland, but it formed on an old logging road near BC, near Nelson, BC. So it really is constructed on a logging road. Interesting. Okay, this is the last one right here. Okay, this wetland right here, you're looking at a series of wetlands here. 2 years old. They were restored at Earl Ranch near Newgate, BC. Pretty amazing that we can restore wetlands that sure appear and function a lot like natural wetlands. Okay, so we humans often show great concern if a wetland is natural or constructed. In fact, I've had people with PhDs tell me that restored wetlands are better than constructed wetlands. And they tell me that a wetland restoration is always better than wetland construction. But you know what? It's like saying, what arm do you like better, your right arm or your left arm? Well, actually, I like them both. I want to lose either one. Well, we've lost our right arm of wetlands because of wetland drainage. So if we don't get involved in restoring wetlands, we won't have any wetlands left. And another thing is that this does not appear to be a concern to the animals that use wetland areas. As long as they can find the plants and the hiding places they need and the water and the habitat, they really don't mind if the wetland is constructed or natural. But yet we want to protect the natural wetlands that are out there and do what we can to hold on to these because they can't be replaced. Wetlands can't be replaced. Each one is unique. Okay, so now it is possible to restore wetlands that appear and function similar to natural wetlands. And it is possible to restore these so they do not require maintenance. The wetlands that the BC Wildlife Federation is building are soon colonized by native plants. This wetland is only 1 year old in this photo. We're finding that we can bring back culturally important plants like the wapato, important to First Nations, and here this plant is growing naturally in wetlands that we've restored near Creston. So you may ask, can I build a wetland? Can you build a wetland? Well, allow me to introduce you some dedicated individuals who are building wetlands across the province. And the folks you're looking at here are members of the Cowichan Land Trust. They want to do something about soil carrying pollutants into Quamachan Lake near Duncan. So they built a series of wetlands that would capture the sediment and treat the water coming off a development on the mountain. And here's what 4 other wetlands appear 1 year later that are now cleaning this runoff. I'd like to introduce you to Terry Halloran, who has pioneered the restoration of wetlands in the Meadow Creek area. And he decided to take the farm that his grandfather had drained wetlands on and to begin restoring these unique habitats for wildlife. And Terry is great. He sends me photos every so often of the wetlands that have been restored on his land and of all the wildlife species that are using them. Who wouldn't want to look at this wetland from your front porch? I mean, it's beautiful. You know, it's interesting about Meadow Creek. Terry Halloran started it with the wetland work, while his neighbor, Audrey Matthews, decided she would also like wetlands on her farm. So here she is standing near a nearly restored wetland on her farm, right across the road from Terry Halloran's. And then a few years later, Manon Van Tool, a neighbor to Terry Halloran and Audrey Matthews, joined the club of wetland builders right here. And in Selmo, we have Jerry Nelliston, who's built a number of wetlands on his land near Selmo. Now, these folks do not have PhDs in wetland ecology. These folks are not professional engineers, but they are dedicated and they want to help the environment. And they will host these projects. And here's Alex and Judy Burland. They built wetlands on their farm near Selmo, Tullaberry Farm. Special folks here, Heather Tolles. She works at a Shoppers Drug Mart in Kamloops, and Milt Stanley, who's a retired math teacher. And they have volunteered to build wetlands in the Kamloops and Barnhart Vale for many years now. Just remarkable what they've accomplished. And I love this photo. We're building a wetland near Barnhart Vale, and Milt Stanley was so excited, he did his happy dance. He said, "This is the most rewarding thing I've ever done," he said, "is to restore these wetlands. And the wetlands they're building are being used by wildlife. This is unbelievable habitat that Heather and Milt have helped to build. We have western painted turtles, Great Basin spadefoots, Columbia spotted frogs, and many other species using these wetlands." Now here's Elka Wind. She's a professional herpetologist. She now designs and builds wetlands to provide breeding habitat for rare species of amphibians. What do you think of the work she's doing? Beautiful, isn't it? These are some nice looking wetlands. Here's Sarma Lipens. She's standing near one of the new wetlands she built near Barnhart Vale, BC. And she's building wetlands to really help the Great Basin spadefoot, to provide breeding habitat for the Great Basin spadefoot. And Sarma is so dedicated, she built a wetland in her backyard. I love it. If you're tired of mowing and pulling weeds, why not turn your backyard into a small ephemeral wetland? It's a valuable thing to do. Purnima Gavindala-Julu, she took the lead in building wetlands at the Halliburton Farm on Vancouver Island. And the wetlands she's building, you can hear Pacific tree frogs calling from them right in the city. Maybe you've met Brian Totaro at Stanley Park. He's worked with hundreds of volunteers to restore this bog wetland in the background. And these volunteers have spent thousands of hours on their hands and knees removing non-native plants from the bog, and it is a unique ecosystem. Here's Edith Tobe. She restores wetlands in the estuary near Squamish, BC, and she has designed and implemented some major wetland and stream restoration projects in the area. Here's Greg. He's actively restoring wetlands in the Kootenays. So if you're interested in wetland restoration, contact the BC Wildlife Federation. The BC Wildlife Federation, we're available to help you design wetland projects in your community. We'll help you identify areas where wetlands may be restored, like this big ditch that used to be a wetland area. We'll examine your site on the ground with you and identify historic actions that were taken to drain the wetlands. And we'll bring out the engineering equipment and we'll help you take elevations and mark where it's possible to restore wetland areas. Oftentimes we will dig deep test holes and identify what wetland technique to use for restoration. And then also the BC Wildlife Federation will help to obtain the funding by assisting you with the writing of grants and applications of funding. The Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program and the Columbia Basin Trust are major funders of wetland restoration projects in the Columbia River Basin. And they have been a great partner to work with on many projects that we have ongoing right now to help fish and wildlife. If you're interested in learning more about wetlands and how they're built and their value to many different species, the BC Wildlife Federation Wetlands Institute is being held in Comox Valley and on Galena Island. And it's scheduled for Saturday, October 2nd to Friday, October 8th, 2021. There's no charge for the training, but participants are asked to cover their own costs for travel, meals, and lodging. And attending the BC Wildlife Federation Wetlands Institute, you'll be able to work with heavy equipment operators to build wetland areas. Now, if you're interested in learning more about wetlands and their construction, I encourage you to read these books that I've written. And these contain many excellent stories about people just like you who are interested enough in wetlands to protect them and then to begin restoring them. So wetlands are amazing ecosystems that have so many values to communities. They're areas that naturally clean runoff and recharge groundwater and are just fascinating places to visit. The wetlands that are out there are providing unparalleled opportunities for people to see wildlife. And the wetlands are providing habitat for some very rare species of animals. I mean, where else are you going to find the grizzly bear but feeding in wetland areas that are in remote locations? So I encourage you to protect wetlands in your community and to consider wetland restoration. There are so many wetlands that have been drained across the province and so many opportunities to bring back these ecosystems. Please contact the BC Wildlife Federation or myself if you have any questions about wetlands. You can reach me at tombiebighauser@gmail.com. Thanks for watching this presentation, and I hope that you will be able to get out and to enjoy wetlands soon. And remember to bring your phone and your camera. Thank you.